Napoleon, Alexander, Roman Empire, you name it. I mean, great, incredible power, big success, fifth wave of Elliott, then 3 waves down, actually, arguably much more waves downwards, right? Like, where are they now? It's a rhetorical question, you know? Greetings, this is Eugene the Philosopher, the greatest living philosopher after the unfortunate passing of Quentin Robert de Nameland, who has been the greatest living philosopher before me. I wish to talk to you about one interesting phenomenon. So whenever you're reading some encyclopedia about some great person, like a genius or a big cultural movement or something, you might read something like, well, they were influential and they've embodied the pinnacle of blank, you know, whatever, insert your favorite genre here. And I want to highlight a simple idea that is frequently overlooked with regards to this specific formulation. If you look at the definition of what a pinnacle is, or a peak is, if you wish, well, a peak is a point at which you have everything else pretty much on the right and the left of it is lower, right? The peak is towering above everything else. So, incidentally, if we're talking about like a temporal breakdown of things, reaching your peak means like later on you're starting to go down, right? It's the start, the peak is essentially a start of the downfall of a crisis of decay or death even. A pretty interesting way of looking at all the high achievements, or highest achievements even, don't you think? Because after them, only lower achievements can be made by definition of the highest achievements. And of course, records don't count, because if you have any sort of linear metric, like a guy jumped 3 meters, then maybe, well, in 50 years, maybe another guy can jump 3.5 meters, of course. So we're not talking about this here. We're talking about more abstract things, like the development of movements that encompass big amounts of people, all right? So yeah, a pretty interesting way of looking at things. So usually people only notice the first half, where they praise a person or a movement for becoming a peak after a rise, right? So it was kind of low, but then they've kind of elevated it to the peak. What they don't see, or rather they don't talk about, however, is the second half, which is there was a peak at this guy or this movement, and then it came all crashing down, right? So this is what I want to highlight here, that the peak is actually the start of a collapse. And this is how it should be perceived, because we're kind of more concerned about what comes next rather than what was before. At least I think we should be. Anyways, so there's a interesting example of this in economics, in technical analysis. So as you know, there is a fundamental analysis and technical analysis. I won't go into details. This is way beyond the topic of this video, but we have the Elliott wave analysis in technical analysis. So it says that essentially all the motions of the market can be described as the combination of 8 waves. So there is a 5 waves up, one up, a smaller down, a big one up, smaller down, and a 5th up again, and then 3 down. 1 down, 1 slightly up, and 1 down again. So 5 plus 3. And then it fractally repeats on smaller scales and on larger scales as well. And it could be reverted, by the way. The main motion could be downwards in the first place. But we're talking about some sort of growth. So I'm highlighting the upwards motion first. So it's this 5th wave up that is the last, that reaches the peak, and that's after which only the motion downwards remains, So yeah, so-called correction, Alright, so, and regarding that, by the way, regarding this topic, Nietzsche has an interesting note about, strong people / geniuses, or strong movements in general, like political or cultural movements. He's saying that, well, they are powerful, obviously, that's why we call them strong, but they always leave a barren wasteland behind. You can also remember this quote from Pablo Picasso, who said that good artists copy and great artists steal. So basically what it means is that they take your stuff, you know, they suck everything into them. And this could be attributed to big cultural or political movements as well. They tend to attribute everything to themselves, everything they see around, everything they could at least appropriate, at least in some manner. So yeah, in this way, by the way, the Nietzsche himself became attributed to a movement made by a guy with a funny mustache, right? The Austrian painter. So anyway, these like geniuses or strong movements, they often make their colleagues, well, if we're talking about geniuses, like famous, let's say artists, they make their colleagues almost invisible. Right? And Brian Eno, the musician, has an interesting concept for this. He calls it scenius. So there's genius from the word like genes, right? Or genus, Latin word, but there is a word scene. And he says scenius from this, right? So there is a big scene where many artists perform or do whatever the arts they are in, and like a genius arises from the scene. This is the statement of Brian Eno, and it's very interesting. But my point with regards to this video on Nietzsche's note is that genius tends to steal from the scene and like cast their shadow on the scene. So only the genius is known by the public, even though he or she was raised by this huge collective, right? Essentially, the scene. Interesting concept anyways. So these geniuses or large cultural or political motions movements rather, tend to kind of scoop up and usurp everything around them, just as Picasso said, again. But anything that they cannot use, they just simply discard or like ignore or like, again, cast their shadow onto it. So it's usually not great being near one of these strong people or strong political or cultural movements, because you may get crushed at worst. At best, you'll just be forgotten and ignored. And there's an anecdote about Schopenhauer, Arthur Schopenhauer, the philosopher, not philosopher, by the way, who was lecturing at the same time as Hegel, a much more famous philosopher, at the Berlin University in 1820s. So, and only like Schopenhauer hated Hegel, and he deliberately put the times of his lectures at the same time as Hegel's lectures, and voila, only 5 people came to Schopenhauer's lectures because all the hundreds of people were listening to Hegel at the same time, right? So yeah, and speaking of, that's to the point of like you being overpowered by the genius who kind of scoops up everything, right? In fact, if you ask me, like Schopenhauer is objectively a much bigger genius than Hegel, but that's a separate issue. Watch my video, Tier List of Philosophers, by the way. I'll link it in the description, where I describe what I think about both of them and many others, like 100 of philosophers. So yeah, and speaking of Hegel, by the way, he was the pinnacle, again, the peak of German classical idealism, so-called, and who could have thought that he also left a barren wasteland after him. So there was no German idealism after Hegel because he was the peak of it, and then it's all downwards, you know, just as we've discussed. And if we look at politics, there's many more examples, obviously, like again, already mentioned Austrian painter with funny mustache. Like he started a movement that sucked some, not all, but some of the most talented people in Germany and neighboring countries, and they started like working for it, and all the resources and everything was kind of sucked into it, almost like a hurricane, you know. So yeah, and big success again. The incredible might at the peak. At the peak, they were very strong, but you know how it ended, right? Mongolian Empire, Genghis Khan, great success. 5th wave of Elliott, then all downwards, right? Of course, I don't really think Mongolian Empire actually existed, but that's anyways. Nobody cares. Napoleon, Alexander, Roman Empire, you name it. I mean, great, incredible power, big success, fifth wave of Elliott, then 3 waves down, actually, arguably much more waves downwards, right? Like, where are they now? It's a rhetorical question, you know? So there's always this big thing, well, or a person, which steals and usurps resources almost like a cancer, at everyone else's expense pretty much, and then reaches the peak of such accumulation and then goes down in a blaze of glory, or maybe just decays slowly over decades or hundreds of years even. Of course, going down in a blaze of glory is a very manly way to go, a very masculine way to go, and actually like no irony or sarcasm here, yeah. So it's captivating to become a part of something like this, but, well, you know how you should know rather how it will end, essentially. So yeah, and there are obviously examples from art and other areas, like think of any genre of, again, painting, music, like what is surrealism after Dali? It's all down. What is grunge after Nirvana? It's all down. What is funk after George Clinton? It's all down. So yeah, so basically the peak is what kind of, it's the tomb, you know, it's what kind of solidifies this thing, like idealizes it almost, and then just removes it from society and sends it to the museum, essentially. So, or a history book. So that's what we're talking about. That's what the peak is. Like, when we look at history, we only see these peaks. History of anything, actually. We only see these peaks. But what does it mean? It means that, well, after that, it was all down. Like, whatever it was. But we only see the peaks of these mountains over the horizon, right? But we don't see the scenius of Eno that supports these peaks, that these peaks have stolen from, essentially, as Picasso said, etc., etc. Interesting thing to think about. Yeah, and regarding other things, science, arguably, I would argue at least, that it has already reached its peak sometime before, like maybe in 1970s or about so. And since then, it's already going down, and it's gonna become more and more obvious. And as I claim in one of my videos, I'm gonna link it in the description, I just don't remember the title, science is dead, it just doesn't know it yet, right? This is the situation we're in right now. And in the future, again, as I've argued many times, science would be treated like, pretty much like religion is treated now. So almost like a superstition. But like still many people would do it, just like many people do religion right now. I mean, many people are very religious right now. We would have scientism's fanatics in the future as well, just as we have now. But it's not going to be the main thing anymore, if you know what I mean, in society. Like again, at some point I've argued that the art is going to be the next main thing. I'm not sure about this right now, but I'm still going to link it in the description. Hegemony of Art, the video is called. Okay, so what's the moral of the story? Let's try to conclude this somehow. Well, it's gonna sound slightly esoteric, but considering everything I've told you before, it should be pretty much crystal clear. So the moral of the story can be formulated in the way, like the slogan of Haskell Foundation. So let me firstly tell you something about them. So Haskell Foundation have developed a programming language, Haskell, which is a functional programming language versus imperative programming languages. So I'm not going to go into details, but let's just put it this way. It's not the most popular way of programming. Okay? So that's why they made this slogan. However, I think they stress it differently than I want to stress it with the purposes of this video. But I'm still going to steal their slogan, just like Picasso said. And the slogan is, avoid success at all costs. So I think, I've read like some of their pamphlets, and I think their idea is, avoid success at all costs. Whereas my idea is, avoid success at all costs. Okay, so hopefully you can hear the difference. Yeah, so this is the moral of the story, I think. At least that's the moral that I took from this story that I just told you. And I can also remember the quote from François de la Rochefoucauld, who said that a refusal of praise is a desire to be praised twice, which in this context that we're talking about means that avoiding success would essentially prolong the success. And there was also Thomas Merton, the monk, the American monk, who also said, quite literally formulated it like this: avoid success at all costs. But he meant like avoid chasing money, essentially, because you would end up neglecting your life. That was his point, but my point is more fundamental, actually. I'm saying that success, the peak, is where you start falling. Therefore, in order to not start falling, you avoid success at all costs. Do not reach your peak. Yeah? Thank you for watching. The eons are closing. If you wish to support me, please consider joining my Patreon. That is patreon.com/philosopher. See the link in the description. Or if you have a scientific theory of your own and you'd like my help in developing it, please join my alternative science coaching program, also available through Patreon.